Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor Emeritus of Brazilian History and Culture at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today we have decided to invite back Andrea Pagliarini, who is a member of the editorial team that produces the Washington Brazil office's weekly newsletter, to join us in talking about the current elections in the United States and its effects on Brazil. Andre is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Louisiana State University, who specializes in 20th century Brazilian history. Welcome to Brazil Unfiltered, Andre.
It's so good to be back with you, Jim, to talk about all this. Thank you.
Great. So let's just jump right in. This has been a really turbulent political month in the United States. I will confess that after Biden's speech, I couldn't listen to the news for 2 or 3 weeks. I was so distraught. So what is your assessment of what happened in the Democratic Party and the decision for Biden not to run for re-election?
It really is a kind of historically, at least distinctive moment that we're in, right? I mean, the last time something like this, something close to this happened was 1968. As you say, we were in the situation, I think, where the path for the election seemed set. It seemed like the dynamics of the race between Biden and Trump were fixed into place. The lines of attack, especially Trump, was developing, I think, were pretty clear. And I think most of us were prepared for several more months of the same kind of campaign to play out. It didn't look like there was much that was going to change until this major change happened with Biden finally giving into internal pressure, but also I think a good bit of external pressure too. I mean, many of Biden's closest high-profile supporters insisted that this was what happened when he removed his candidacy, was the result of like donors, and it was a coup. When really poll after poll indicates that a large swath of voters, the majority of voters of every demographic, of every age group, saw that the current president was not on a path to build a winning campaign. And so I think one way of looking at what happened is as a sign that there is still a way in which popular pressure can exert a really perhaps unexpected outcome. That is to change the nominee of the party, which is no small thing. And all of a sudden, the dynamic of the race has been completely upended in a way that we've seen the Trump folks, kind of looking for their line of attack for a campaign that was designed to be run against Joe Biden. So I think for the first time, and I think here a comparison with Brazil sometimes is worth considering, as I'm sure we'll get into. But this idea that for so long Democrats have been reacting to the far right in this country, they've been responding to attacks and playing defense so much. For the first time in a long time, we've seen the Democrats go a little bit on the offensive and take some of the momentum and the energy to the Republicans in a way that in the Brazilian case, it seems like many, many, many years now, but it's really since 2018, especially, that anyone, sort of on the center left responding to the far right has really felt on the defensive. And so hopefully this signals a change in the momentum that can be sustained going forward for
I
anyone who
must.
cares about democracy and these kind of things.
I was on a radio program last week organized by Brasil de Fato with one of the founders of the MST, the Landless Peasants Movement, and people were asking me, do I think Biden was going to resign? And I said, no, I don't think he would. I was really convinced that he was going to stick it out. And I didn't even read the cards when Nancy Pelosi sent the signal. And I should have realized when Nancy Pelosi said it's time to move on, that
Mm.
it was really the sign that the establishment of the Democratic Party was ready to look for an alternative. So, what's your initial assessment of Kamala Harris?
It's a really, again, kind of complicated position because it's not as if she is a political powerhouse or that she was a political powerhouse in her own right. I mean, obviously, being elected senator of the state of California is no small thing. That takes a certain amount of political chops. But many viewers probably remember her run for president in 2020, which started with great fanfare. She delivered, I remember, a very powerful opening speech when she declared her candidacy for the nomination, and people thought, I think, she would be a very serious contender, and she proves not to be. And there are all kinds of reasons we can talk about for that. In my opinion, one of the clearest reasons for why she fizzled out in 2020 was that she, in the past, has tended to lack a clear orientation politically. At one point, for example, she supported Medicare for all, and then she kind of walked it back, and then you kind of were left with, well, what kind of Democrat is she? In a way, in this position that she is in now, that might actually help her, this kind of amorphous political identity, because it means that she can galvanize different parts of the Democratic base who see in her perhaps a little bit what they want to see. And also on the other side, it's hard for I think Republicans, it's been hard to really pin her down convincingly. Trump and his campaign are saying she's a leftist radical, she's a socialist radical, and all this stuff. But if anything, her record is much more as a sort of law and order, attorney general Democrat. And so the thing that might have hurt her in 2020, this amorphous difficulty of pinning her down ideologically, in my opinion, seems to be actually helping her lock up the nomination and give her a little boost. Now, it's worth pointing out that, it's still at the very least an extremely close race. I'm not sure that we can say the momentum has completely swung yet, but I think there are promising signs. And again, I think she leaves herself enough room politically to appeal to different sectors of the Democratic base in ways that many other people I don't think could. So that's a real strength I think she has for her at this moment. Ironically, it's a strength.
So it's a real contested race right now, you're saying?
It seems that way. I mean, one thing I always, when I'm talking to Brazilian friends and relatives, but the research, the poll says, Trump is up 2 nationally, Trump is up 1 nationally. I say, you got to forget the national polls. Those mean almost nothing. Not nothing, but almost nothing. What matters, of course, is to dig into individual states, as American viewers know. And there, it's close both nationally and in the individual states. But we have seen, I think, polls demonstrate much better performance, a statistically significant performance improvement with Kamala Harris the top of ticket than Biden, which again I think is a vindication of many of those who were hoping Biden would step aside. In the polls, almost any Democrat was doing better than Joe Biden. So I see it as a promising moment for the anti-Trump coalition, which is a broad coalition of center-right folks all the way to left-wing folks. And so I think it's for once in a very long time, I think as you alluded to earlier, there is a sense of hope, at least that the dynamics can be changed in a fundamental way.
And in Brazil, I'm currently in Rio, and I've been involved in a conference this last week. Everyone is asking me about what's happening, what the possibilities are, and everyone is hoping that she might manage to beat Trump. So let's talk about the connections between Brazil and the United States in this election campaign. If you recall, during the international movement in defense of democracy in Brazil, a journalist coined the phrase Bolsonaro being the Trump of the tropics, which gave enough information to people in the United States to draw analogies between 2 authoritarian figures. It's really amazing how Bolsonaro copied the Trump playbook, from vaccination denials to refusing to wear a mask to claiming that the election results were fraudulent and encouraging his supporters to take over the buildings of the 3 branches of government in order to provoke a coup d'etat. So after the recent assassination attempt on Trump, many Brazilians immediately started to compare it to the stabbing of Jair Bolsonaro during the night of the 2018 election, in terms of its consequences and what the impact had on the election in Brazil, and what his assassination attempt might have on the elections in the United States. How do you view these comparisons?
I think well, first of all, it's really intriguing from a sort of media perspective how the story of the campaign, not that the attempted shooting of Donald Trump has faded from the news, but the way in which changing the nominee of the Democratic Party has become, such an all-consuming story that it's almost as if the shooting, has been put on the back burner somewhat. Now, one thing that I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy right after the attempted shooting against Donald Trump, specifically making some connections between the stabbing of Bolsonaro and politically the fallout from that. And one point that I make in that piece is that, one thing that happened after the stabbing of Jair Bolsonaro a month before Brazilians went to the polls in 2018 was that both on the left and the right, Brazilian politics became on this issue consumed by a kind of almost a buffet of conspiracy theories, all kinds on the left and the right. The Bolsonaro family insisted it was set up by the left. Many on the left insisted it had been staged. And one thing I argue with this piece is that I think anyone who is opposed to seeing Trump win in the fall needs to try as much as possible to steer clear of conspiracy theory thinking. I don't think that yielded anything, for progressive forces in Brazil. It's kind of stewing in these kind of these kind of hazy conspiracies. I think on the right, that is happening, and that's going to happen. There's maybe a tendency toward conspiratorial thinking on the right and on the left too. But I don't think that should be something that many on the left go down. I think instead they should be using this new momentum that we've been discussing to try to reframe the terms of the debate. Because what we saw at the Republican National Convention was an attempt to really, I think, frame this debate as one of almost divine authority invested in Trump. And we saw something like that, I think, after Bolsonaro's stabbing, that it really galvanized a part of the electorate that was already looked at him favorably. But this survival and assassination attempt adds another level, another layer of kind of of support to that. And so I think in the U.S. case this time, focusing on the political debate, the political arguments, the issues, and again, changing the nominee offers a chance to reframe that debate. And I think it's been really successful. I'm curious how you think. It sounds like in Brazil too, people are talking to you that all of a sudden the conversation is completely different. And I think that's what the Democrats needed, was a completely different conversation.
No,
yeah.
No, you're absolutely right, because everyone was talking about the conspiracies, and I was joking with people. Yeah, because one of the conspiracies on the left was that Bolsonaro had cancer, and this was really a maneuver to get him to the hospital to have an operation to remove stomach cancer. And I just, come on, guys, give me a break with it. And so the same thing. I mean, I don't fully understand why this guy did it. It's very strange, the story, but I think you're absolutely right, and it did totally shift the story. Even the bandage on the ear became kind of looking kind of silly at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Regard.
I mean, I remember there were some people who were hoping that if Biden is going to drop out, he should do it during Trump's speech to try to steal some of the focus. But I think the timing worked out pretty well. As you say, already some of that imagery and the divine, this God chose Trump, all of a sudden they're forced now to respond to the Kamala news. And so, I think this kind of savvy in terms of messaging and timing and all this has been missing for a while. And I think that's kind of exciting if you don't want to see Trump win. It's exciting to see a kind of energy on this side of the political aisle that isn't just reactive. And I think that's key. And we saw that in Brazil in 2018. I remember, Jim, talking to you a lot during that campaign. We were together, parts of it. It just seemed like anyone to the left of Bolsonaro was kind of cowering and kind of covering their heads and saying, "Oh man, I think we can." And then the election happened, and it was this terrible outcome. I think the ability to try to reset and reframe the debate, again, it might not work. We're about 4 months away. We'll see what happens. But the early results, I think, are pretty clear that something has happened in this campaign. Right? It matters that the candidate changed, and I think that's what people were hoping for.
I also made a false analogy between the difficulty of Fernando Haddad, who was the candidate to substitute Lula when he was in prison and not able to run, and saying the transfer was very difficult. But I think it's a different situation here in that regard. I think that there's clear unity in the Democratic Party behind Kamala Harris. There's going to be no challenger. The other surprising results was that when Robert Kennedy was in the race, I was assuming he would steal votes from the left, but no, it seems that it basically hurts Trump a lot. I guess that's because of his similarity in terms of a vaccine denial and other questions draws affinity from people on the extreme right, as opposed to people who might be Democrats or from their family tradition were Democrats, and the name Kennedy kind of has some allure. I must remember that you and I both were at Brown when two of Robert Kennedy's grandchildren were there, and one of them commented, "Forget it. I mean, no one in the family respects Robert Kennedy at all. I mean, he's kind of the outlier in our family, and just kind of ignore him." This was way before he was a candidate for president. So, Well, this is another question I wanted to draw in terms of comparisons between the two countries. That has to do with the way in which the extreme right is opposing women's reproductive rights, especially including the right to abortion. And I think that if you recall, very recently there was a proposed law that would have penalized women who were raped and had an abortion twice as much as the person who committed the abortion. The maximum sentence for a person committing a rape is 10 years, and for being involved in an abortion, if a woman had an abortion, which is not legal in Brazil, it would have been 20 years. And so this provoked a huge mobilization of women in the streets and their allies, and basically they had to withdraw the proposed law. It didn't get any traction at all. How do you see the question of
Yeah.
reproductive rights playing out in the American elections and this comparison?
This is another opportunity, as like, it sort of fits in with what we've been saying about progressives generally setting the terms of the debate, as opposed to simply reacting. I'm reminded a little bit of, I was reading something earlier about the 2004 race where Republicans at many states in the presidential campaign ran these ballot initiatives to ban same-sex marriage as a way of getting evangelicals to the polls and galvanizing their own base, and it worked very successfully. A lot of states John Kerry was competitive in went the other way because of in part this turnout mechanism. It seems that reproductive rights and women's health issues have been having that effect in the last few years in the United States, in a way that I think someone like Kamala, just to go back to what we were saying, right? She embodies those disputes, that set of issues, obviously much more clearly than Joe Biden, whose support of abortion rights has been sort of mixed and muddled over the course of his career. He's never been someone to sort of offer a full-throated defense of abortion rights. And so if that's the terrain the Democrats want to be sort of fighting on, because the polls show even women who are conservative are, in statistically significant numbers, opposed to some of these most retrograde attempts. And that's a powerful potential issue for Democrats. It's a little bit like the piece of legislation you were just saying in Brazil. It got so much pushback. I mean, you had, for the first time I can remember in my life, maybe it happened at other times, but I can't remember, television presenters, Luciano Huck, on TV, and it's completely sort of apolitical show on the weekend, pointing out what an absurdity this piece of legislation was, and urging personally Arthur Lira, the Speaker of the lower house of Congress, to revise and look into this. Because this proposed legislation that you mentioned, which would have punished rapists less severely than women who got an abortion, I think struck a nerve as sort of too far in the kind of culture war around women's issues that we've seen. I mean, right, part of what has defined the rise of the far right in Brazil and Bolsonarismo is a kind of misogyny. It's a hostility to all kinds of sectors of society, but women included in that. And so I think what we saw in that reaction to that proposed piece of legislation was a very clear sense of this is too far. Whether the opposition to Bolsonarismo can build on that in the years ahead to say that, look, this is an affront on this issue, but there are all kinds of affronts happening on other issues too that people should be outraged about. I suppose that remains to be seen. But that moment that you mentioned, I think, was similar to what I've been describing, a sense that, wait a minute, it's possible not just to react, but to really put these people on the defensive. And that's the kind of thing that in this global moment of the far right's strengthening and consolidation, I think people who are generally progressive are looking for these moments where you can begin to kind of flip the dynamics. That's why this presidential election in the fall in the United States is so important, because it represents the terrain on which these battles globally are playing out. If Donald Trump wins, the dispute around the world on basic issues of human rights and things like women's rights, that'll look a certain way if Trump wins. If the Democrat wins, if Kamala Harris wins, that dispute will play out in a certain way. This is why, obviously, Brazil is so interested in the outcome of what happens here, Europeans, everywhere around the world, because it will help set the terms for the political disputes in the years ahead.
It was interesting because in 2022, after the the Supreme Court decision eliminating Roe versus Wade and the right for women to have an abortion, a federally constituted right, I was talking to a fairly prominent Brazilian person involved in activism, and the person didn't understand at all. And I said, abortion rights is going to be a major issue in the next elections. And the person didn't understand what I was saying because it seems like you can't raise the question in Brazil of abortion rights,
Yeah.
even though a large percentage of the population de facto in pragmatic terms believes in abortion when they get pregnant. And I've talked to so many people who have done all these weird things to try to abort when they realized they were pregnant and couldn't do it because they didn't have access to a safe medical practitioner. And so they did all these kind of folk methodologies to try to abort. And so I think women, this is my assessment, I could be wrong. I think women are going to be a really important stealth factor in this election. Under the surface, going out to vote. I think if Kamala chooses two women, a woman as vice presidential candidate, it's going to be a very interesting dynamic because it'll be two men who are extremely sexist saying stupid things. And I can imagine the dialogue between, a couple where the husband might be supporting Trump and the wife saying, look, I don't care about this guy. I'm not supporting him because of the way he treats women. So this is another interesting dynamic in this question. I think we have to kind of look at and see. And I think that's the same thing that happened against Bolsonaro. He was so crude and so disgusting that he really just turned off in a gut way a lot of people who weren't necessarily so enthusiastic about Lula, but really didn't want Bolsonaro back in power. So how do you think, let's look at the scenario in which Trump wins. What would be the impact in the political scenario in Brazil? Would it strengthen the Bolsonaro camp? Would it mark a shift in foreign policy towards Latin America? What will you think would be the result if Trump actually win?
Well, I want to sketch out a scenario and see what you think about this. I think in terms of state relations, head of state to head of state, Lula to Trump, I kind of think Lula is skillful enough and has the experience to carve out a working relationship with Trump in a similar way that AMLO did by avoiding head-on conflicts over major sticking points, finding some areas of agreement. I think if Lula wants to avoid picking a fight, I'm sure that could happen. Because the reason that I think Lula might want to avoid a fight is that given Trump's hostility, in some ways explicit hostility to the post-World War II global order, NATO, and all these things, I think there's a scenario in which a second Trump administration is so disruptive to that order that it ends up opening space for the kind of geopolitical rearranging that Brazil under Lula wants. In other words, it might create space for a reconsideration of the UN's current configurations and European trade deals. So there's a way in which I don't see it as impossible that a Trump win could actually help some of the movements, the geopolitical shift that Lula favors. Now, at the legislative level, I think it clearly would bolster the Bolsonarista component in Congress. We already see, almost constant efforts of people like of Bolsonaro's children in Congress and many allies, really deepening ties with Republicans in Congress and far-right activists in the United States. And such that if Trump were to win, I think they have a relationship, they must have some things almost certainly ready to go in terms of potential sanctions, in terms of potential, hostility toward the Lula government, which the Bolsonaristas favor. I mean, it's right. There's this irony in there, which is that they are deeply nationalistic, deeply patriotic, supposedly, but I think quite clearly are engineering a sanctions regime against Brazil under Lula should Trump win, similar to what has happened with Venezuela. I mean, they've said as much. Flavio Bolsonaro, the senator who is the former president's son, was on Roda Viva a few months ago, and he said, boy, it would be a real shame if Brazil finds itself under a sanctions regime like Venezuela if Trump wins. I don't think he actually sees that as a bad thing. I think they're working towards that. And so, you could imagine this ironic situation where Lula and Trump find a way to work together while in Congress things get very heated. Now, that's one scenario. The other scenario is that Lula would very much make a foil of Trump. But I think if you look at the incentives, and I'm curious what you think, Jim, I don't necessarily see Lula trying to pick a fight with Trump. Should Trump win? Obviously, he prefers the Democrat. He endorsed Biden. He took the unusual step of saying he hopes Biden wins. I'm sure he hopes Kamala wins. But I don't think a Trump win would be the end of, sort of the world for Brazil's foreign policy.
And
And if
there's a
anything, about new opportunities, perhaps.
no, and there's a sector of the Brazilian left. I think it's a minority, but it's an influential minority that is absolutely against NATO, is not critical of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in some way still thinks that Russia is the Soviet Union, and therefore an enemy of our historic enemy, that is the United States, must be our friend. And I mean, it's even in the fact that people don't fully appreciate what Biden did in 22 to support the elections. I
Right.
mean, the fact that the Biden administration went to Brazil, the CIA met with the armed forces and said, look, if you have a coup, we're not going to support it, which is the absolute opposite of what happened 60 years ago. And yet, a lot of people don't see that as an important and significant thing. It's just a hypocrisy, or it's just a maneuver by the part of Biden. And I think people don't understand the trauma that Americans have gone through in Brazil with what the Bolsonaro government was, and what the invasion of the capital was, and what that meant, and the impunity that he's managed to get since then, in the sense that he's only been convicted of rape charges and fraud, but not against the direct attacks on democracy. So this is something that,
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, that there is a sector of the left that ironically sees themselves not in alliance with, but seeing a kind of a mutual campaign against the hegemony of what they see as the new world, the world order post 1989, and the desire to see it weakened. It's a very interesting dynamic in this regard. On the other hand, these same people are very concerned, but Trump might win because it has an effect on the elections in 26 here. How do you see that might
Right.
affect if Trump wins? How do you see that might affect what might happen in the 26 elections in Brazil?
Well, ironically, but just as another side note, I have a cousin, a relative, who's a very strong Bolsonaro person, 100% Bolsonaro. And yet he said he works in agro in Brazil. He's an engineer, an agricultural engineer. He said actually Trump kind of scares him. And I said, that's interesting, ideologically. He said, well, Trump represents chaos in global markets in ways that are not good for predictability, that are not necessarily good for Brazilian agricultural exports, which is my relative's line of business. So I said, oh, that's a really interesting point. That Trump's kind of chaos and who knows what he's going to do is actually not great if you work in agriculture, because you want to know who you're selling to, what the market's going to look like in a year, 2 years, 3 years. And Trump represents uncertainty in a way that Democrats, are mostly mainstream, mostly kind of normal, which, as you were saying earlier, some on the Brazilian left, and I've seen this on Twitter and conversations with friends and anecdotally, they say, yeah, Kamala represents imperialism as usual. She's the normal kind of mainline Democrat who's going to do all the bad things that the U.S. always does. Trump at least is different. I don't share that way of thinking. I think Trump is a really dangerous figure. To your point about the 2026 election in Brazil, if we saw some kind of renewed challenge to the ballot box in Brazil, to the peaceful transfer of power, I cannot imagine a situation in which a Trump administration carries out the efforts you were just describing that the Biden folks did, which is to again and again assiduously repeat to Brazilian military members and influential figures that the United States would not support any political action outside of the constitutional strictures. I can't imagine the Trump administration doing that. And I think the very fact that we can't imagine it acts as a kind of permission structure for those who would undermine the election.
I mean, we have to consider the possibility that, if Kamala Harris wins and Trump loses, is he going to challenge the election results again and insist on that? And is that fuel to encourage the same discourse in Brazil? If we look at the way in which in Venezuela, the current president was, questioning Brazilian election results, which caused a very kind of unusual dynamic.
Yeah.
When Lula made a statement that if those in power lose, they need to leave power and not stay in power. They need to represent the election results, which is a very important and important contribution to the question of what is democracy. That you lose, you leave, you don't stay. Uh, I can imagine this feeding into 26 and weakening, or strengthening the right and weakening the left, and perhaps giving an advantage to Tarcísio, the governor of São Paulo, who seems to be the front runner at this point. It's still very early, of course, but so what do
Because
you?
I could see a situation, Jim, where one gets this sort of bad, dark feeling about the election this fall. Because let's say even if Kamala is able to come from behind and win this election, so much work has been done before then. Trump is already saying the only way he can lose is the standard stuff. Only way he can lose is if it's stolen. Let's say there's a dispute in this fall over the election. Kamala wins. The fact that there's yet again a dispute over the peaceful transfer of power, I agree with you. It's going to be picked up by the far right in Brazil, and so I don't see necessarily a situation in which that threat in Brazil, the anti-democratic threat in Brazil, goes away no matter what happens here. They're certainly be watching for cues, but unfortunately, I think this basic premise that if you lose, you leave. I'm not sure that will be operative for the far right in Brazil, at least in the next election. And so people have to be vigilant. Organizations like the WBO and anyone else interested in the cause of democracy in Brazil has to continue paying attention, right? Because this is a threat that we keep seeing reemerge, even in defeat.
And I think the efforts of Eduardo Bolsonaro to go to the United States to try to get Eduardo or Carlos. I simply mix up the names. So it's Carlos or Eduardo.
The one who was here was Eduardo.
Eduardo, exactly. So to try to get the U.S. Congress to pass a law saying that Brazil is not a democracy, that it violates freedom of the speech and freedom of the press, and basically create a notion of Brazil as a pariah. If Trump is elected, I think this is something that's going to be extremely, extremely possible to be pushed forward, because Eduardo Bolsonaro, the family has deep connections with sectors of the far right, which have influence in the Democrat and the Republican Party. Even though Steve Bannon is not running the electoral campaign, he has a voice, he has an echo, and he has a way of influencing things. Other
It's why
people,
it matters who holds the House this fall too, right? That these things really, really matter for if you care about Brazil-U.S. relations, for these things, for what you're describing to move forward, right? If Democrats can hold the House, these people can continue shouting into the dark, and it's bad, but at least they won't have any power. But if they win the presidency and the House and the Senate, then exactly, you're looking at a really difficult situation for potential U.S.-Brazil relations.
so what do you, in your mind, would be the effect of the victory by Kamala Harris on U.S.-Brazil relations?
In a way, the flip side of what I was saying earlier about Trump, I do think, in a way, Kamala Harris, who, as far as I know, and I was doing a lot of research the past few days, does not have a deep relationship with South America, right? As vice president, she was put in charge of root causes of immigration, primarily in Central America. But I don't think she has a deep relationship with South America, let alone Brazil. I My impression is that things might more or less proceed as they have been, which is not, but maybe benign neglect is too strong a word. I think, to its credit, the Biden administration has never told Lula, at least publicly, look, you need to choose a relationship with the United States or a relationship with China. That hasn't happened. Like what happened in the Cold War, where it's with us or against us. I don't get the sense that Kamala would be harsher in that way. She has signaled that a full change in her foreign policy team would come. So people like Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, this would not be the foreign policy team. So right now we're kind of reading tea leaves. What might a Kamala foreign policy look like? I imagine, barring anything out of the ordinary, we might see a continuation of more or less of what we saw under the Biden years, which is not as deeply engaged as even some of the United States would hope for. Look, China is increasing its investment in Latin America. China is an increasing presence the United States needs to do more in terms of investments and all this stuff that it really isn't doing. So more or less, I expect a kind of status quo if she wins towards Latin America. I don't know. What do you think, Jim? What's your sense on
I
that?
mean, there's another element of this too, which is, I mean, Kamala Harris' father was from Jamaica, mother's from India. She has a biracial identity, but she went to Howard University, which is an historically black college, which has a very, very strong sense of racial pride, very strong social organizations, fraternities and sororities that are very, very much
Right.
important in sustaining the black middle class, and in fact, entrepreneurs and people who have been quite successful. And so she has a very strong African American identity, even though people kind of question that because of her South Asian roots as well. Um, but I
That's a
think
good
what
point.
happened is I think she, as so many Black Americans who have a contact with Brazil and really fully understand the country, fall in love with it very quickly and are very excited about that. I know that all of the Black women that I talked to at the conference that I've been attending were extremely excited about the fact that she was elected, even though they might have questions about her geopolitical, ideas, because of the symbolism of what that means and the possibilities of a Black woman being elected president of the United States for women's agency, Black women's agency in Brazil. And I think on the other hand, she might find that same kind of euphoria that many people have when they discover that Brazil is today a majority Black nation in the sense of how people identify race differently from 20 or 30 years ago. And that there's a strong Black women's movement in this country, which is really fighting hard to change the social structure, the traditional hierarchies. And so I think this could also be a kind of another
Yeah.
angle in this that could improve the relations between the two countries, as there are more concrete ways of thinking of how to interact between people to people, as it were, and administration to administration.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'm reminded of the fact that the first Black president, right, Barack Obama, he writes famously that his first exposure to Brazil was through his mother's love of the film Black Orpheus, and he writes about how he remembers watching that in college and thinking, well, you know, certainly it's not this racial fairy tale in Brazil, and yet the symbolism of Carnaval and this kind of very famous film that's produced in this moment of Brazil's cultural ascension in the world really left a mark on him in really profound ways about his own racial identification. So that's a really good point about how Kamala, perhaps she's aware of some of the stuff about, Brazil, Afro-Brazilian culture and through her studies and her background. But that's a way in which it might shape her perceptions of Brazil too, in maybe unexpected ways. So that's a great point.
And so the final question I wanted to ask has to do with the big issue of the day, which is the environment and global warming. The Biden administration during the election campaign, one of the debate speeches, made a big pledge of $10 billion for the Amazon fund, if I'm not mistaken. Was it 10 billion or was it 10? No, it was 10 billion, wasn't it?
That seems right. I remember people were upset that it seemed that it was too low, but it was
Well, then
still a huge number.
I think there was a smaller number that was floated at some point. Regardless of that, and I mean the Biden administration's pledge for the Amazon fund has been much less than people originally expected it to be. Do you have any sense of how it might be different in terms of environmental justice and how this relates to and to Brazil and the real importance of the environmental movement in Brazil, especially in lieu of the fact that the COP20 will be held in Belém do Pará next year, and there's a real attention given to the Amazon and the dangers to the destruction of the Amazon.
So many on the left end of the Democratic Party, more attuned to really big environmental green goals and Green New Deal and all this stuff, were interestingly some of the most prominent voices against Biden stepping down. Now, that's not to say that we can expect Kamala, to not take these issues seriously. I think she would be a very strong advocate of legislation trying to curb climate change and all of these things. I mean, she was a senator from California, which has been a real leader in decarbonization efforts for years now. So, again, there too, I think we would see a great deal of continuity. Um, there are some concerns among some on the left that she has been solicitous, perhaps of their, or that she might be, because again, she has a relatively short national political career. that she might be solicitous to other interests. We just don't really know. My view, though, is that this is the future, I think, of the Democratic Party, of left-wing politics in the United States and elsewhere in the world. That is the embrace of a transition away from fossil fuels. I think that's one of those things, sort of like support for gay rights, LGBTQ rights, in the United States. It's one of those. It's become just part of the fabric of what it means to be a mainstream Democrat. That is, support for environmental rights. So I do think that would continue to be a focus. And when it comes to Brazil, a centerpiece of the relationship in a President Kamala Harris administration with Brazil. So I think that's something that, if you're concerned about those issues, as we all should be, you should be very excited about her election for environmental issues.
So, Andre, we haven't thought about it yet very much, but let's see if we can do an election coverage and maybe in Portuguese to our Brazilian audience who might be curious about, what's happening in the United States in the elections. That would be fun. We'll see if we can do that.
Sort of the reverse of what we did. Remember, we did the election coverage in Brazil in English. I think that went really well.
Yeah, it did go well. I don't know. Let's see if the other can work. We'll look into it and see the possibilities. Any other thing you wanted to add before we end our wonderful interview?
Just that listeners, I know everyone's paying attention to every single step of this campaign. But one thing, as we've been trying to do, is to not just get focused on the horse race of it all, who's up in this state, who's up in that state. Obviously, that's important too. But to think about how others around the world perceive of the stakes of the election, how other people around the world are viewing the election. I think that not only helps us be cognizant of politics elsewhere in the world, but it helps us develop a more sophisticated understanding of the election in the United States, is to think about how this, affects and how this plays out in the minds of others. Because this is not a small country. This is not an unimportant country. What happens here matters enormously for the rest of the world. And if you care about the rest of the world, it's important to think about how they're thinking about it, the election too. So I would just, encourage people to think about that.
Andre, I want to really thank you for spending time with us today on Brazil Unfiltered. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it's always an honor and a pleasure talking with you, Jim. Thanks.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you've not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.